The secret of Pastor Matthew Kaunda that shocked West Africa. The morning sun cast long shadows across the sprawling compound of the New Life Cathedral in Lagos, Nigeria. Cars with license plates from Ghana, Benin, Cameroon, and even as far as South Africa filled the massive parking lot. Inside the cathedral, over 10,000 people packed every seat, aisle, and balcony space available. Pastor Matthew Kaunda stood at the pulpit, his white suit gleaming under the bright lights. At 55 years old, he commanded attention with his deep voice and piercing eyes that seemed to look right through a person's soul. When he raised his hands, the entire congregation fell silent. "In one evening prayer meeting, my brothers and sisters," Pastor Kaunda began, his voice carrying to every corner of the massive building without a microphone. "Today, God wants to show his power among us. Who here has been carrying a burden too heavy for your shoulders?" Hundreds of hands shot up immediately. A woman in the front row began crying. A man near the back fell to his knees. This was the usual scene at New Life Cathedral every Sunday morning. Pastor Kaunda walked down from the pulpit and approached a middle-aged man in a wheelchair. Without saying a word, he placed his hand on the man's forehead. The man's eyes rolled back, and he began shaking violently. Suddenly, he stood up from his wheelchair and began walking around the altar. The crowd erupted in cheers and praise. This was why they came from thousands of miles away. This was the power that made Pastor Matthew Kaunda the most famous religious leader in all of West Africa. But what the congregation didn't know was that their beloved pastor carried a secret darker than the deepest night. Pastor Kaunda's influence stretched far beyond his home church in Lagos. New Life Cathedral had branches in 27 countries across Africa, Europe, and North America. Government ministers flew in private jets just to shake his hand. Presidents called him for advice. Business moguls donated millions to his ministry, hoping for his blessing on their ventures. In his private office on the top floor of the cathedral's administrative building, Pastor Kaunda met with important visitors every day. Today, it was Minister Davidson Okoro from the Federal Ministry of Finance. "Pastor, I need your prayers," Minister Okoro said, wringing his hands nervously. "The president is considering removing me from my position. I've served faithfully for 8 years, but political enemies are spreading lies about me." Pastor Kaunda leaned back in his leather chair and studied the minister carefully. "Brother Davidson, God sees your heart. He knows your faithfulness, but his favor comes with a price." "Anything, Pastor. I'll do anything." "Bring me 50 million naira as a seed offering this Thursday. Plant it in faith and watch God turn your situation around within 7 days." Minister Okoro nodded eagerly. "Yes, Pastor. I'll bring it Thursday evening." "No," Pastor Kaunda said firmly. "Thursday I will travel to the mountain to pray. Bring it Friday morning." After the minister left, Pastor Kaunda's assistant, Brother Samuel, entered the office. Samuel had worked for the pastor for 15 years and was one of the few people who knew some of the pastor's secrets, though not the most important one. "Pastor, the governor of Cross River State wants to schedule a meeting for next week," Samuel reported. "He says it's urgent. Something about the upcoming elections." "Schedule him for next Friday afternoon," Pastor Kaunda replied, checking his expensive gold watch. "And Samuel, make sure no one disturbs me this Thursday night. I'll be on the mountain in deep prayer." Samuel nodded, but something in his pastor's tone made him uncomfortable. In all his years of service, he had never been allowed to accompany Pastor Kaunda on these Thursday night prayer sessions. Sometimes he wondered what really happened on that mountain. Every Thursday at exactly 9 p.m., Pastor Kaunda would drive his black Mercedes-Benz toward his home village of Ogbomoso, about 2 hours from Lagos. He always drove alone, telling everyone he needed solitude to hear from God clearly. But Pastor Kaunda wasn't going to any mountain, he was going to St. Mary's Cemetery, the oldest burial ground in Ogbomoso, where his grandmother had been buried 40 years ago. As his car pulled up to the rusty gates of the cemetery, a hunched figure emerged from the shadows. This was Malam Ibrahim, the cemetery's night security guard. At 72 years old, Ibrahim had been guarding the cemetery for 30 years. He was also Pastor Kaunda's only accomplice in the weekly ritual that had made the pastor the most powerful religious leader in Africa. "Good evening," Pastor Ibrahim greeted, unlocking the gates. "She was buried this afternoon. A fresh one, just as you requested." Pastor Kaunda nodded and followed Ibrahim deep into the cemetery, past rows of old tombstones and weathered monuments. They stopped at a fresh grave covered with wilted flowers and a simple wooden cross. "Who was she?" Pastor Kaunda asked. "A trader from the market. Died of malaria. Young woman, maybe 30 years old. Her family couldn't afford a proper funeral, so they buried her quickly." Pastor Kaunda pulled out a thick envelope filled with cash and handed it to Ibrahim. "Dig her up. You know what to do." This had been their arrangement for 20 years. Every Thursday night, Ibrahim would call Pastor Kaunda whenever a fresh body was buried in the cemetery. The pastor would come, perform his dark ritual with the corpse, and leave before dawn. In return, Ibrahim received enough money to live comfortably and keep his mouth shut. Ibrahim began digging while Pastor Kaunda prepared his ritual items from a black leather bag. Candles, strange oils, and an ancient book written in a language he had learned from his mentor 20 years ago. As Ibrahim dug deeper, Pastor Kaunda reflected on how it all began. 20 years ago, he had been a struggling small-time preacher with only 30 members in his congregation. His wife had left him, taking their 2 children. He was about to give up ministry entirely when he met Dr. Kwame Asante, a Ghanaian, an old man who claimed to know secrets that could make any man wealthy and powerful. Dr. Asante had taught him about the ancient practice of drawing spiritual power from the recently dead. "The life force doesn't leave the body immediately," the old man had explained. "For someone who knows the right rituals, that remaining energy can be transferred and used for great power." The first time Pastor Kaunda performed the ritual, he was disgusted with himself. But when his church began growing rapidly and miracles started happening during his services, his disgust turned to addiction. The power was intoxicating and the results were undeniable. "Pastor, the coffin is ready," Ibrahim called out, interrupting his thoughts. Pastor Kaunda climbed down into the grave and opened the simple wooden coffin. Inside lay a young woman dressed in her best white dress. Her hands folded peacefully across her chest. She looked like she was sleeping. The pastor began his ritual, chanting words in the ancient language while placing his hands on the corpse. As he performed the ceremony, he felt the familiar surge of dark energy flowing through his body. This was the source of his power. This was why the blind could see, the lame could walk, and the barren could conceive when he prayed for them. After an hour, the ritual was complete. Pastor Kaunda climbed out of the grave, and Ibrahim began filling it back up. By morning, no one would ever know the grave had been disturbed. "Same time next week?" Ibrahim asked as they walked back to the cemetery gates. "Yes," Pastor Kaunda replied. "And Ibrahim, remember our agreement. What happens here stays here." "Of course, Pastor. 20 years we've been doing this. I've never told a soul." As months passed, Pastor Kaunda's fame continued to grow. His weekly television program, Signs and Wonders, was broadcast in 15 countries. His books topped bestseller lists across Africa. World leaders sought his counsel, and even Hollywood celebrities flew to Lagos for his blessing. The miracles in his church became more spectacular. During one service, a woman who had been born without arms grew new limbs right in front of the congregation. The event was recorded and went viral on social media, bringing even more followers to his ministry. But with great fame came greater scrutiny. A young investigative journalist named Kemi Johnson from the Lagos Tribune began asking questions about Pastor Kaunda's background. She discovered that before his rise to fame 20 years ago, he had been a struggling preacher with a tiny congregation. She also noticed that his transformation coincided with his weekly trips to his home village. "There's something he's not telling us," Kemi told her editor. "People don't just become miracle workers overnight. I want to investigate his Thursday night trips." Her editor, Mr. Adebayo, was skeptical. "Kemi, Pastor Kaunda is one of the most respected religious leaders in Africa. You're talking about following him around like some kind of stalker. We could face serious legal action. But what if there's a story here? What if the source of his power isn't what people think it is?" Mr. Adebayo considered this. The Lagos Tribune had been struggling financially, and a major exposé could boost their circulation significantly. "Okay, but be careful, and make sure you have solid evidence before you write anything." The following Thursday night, Kemi Johnson sat in her small Honda Civic outside the New Life Cathedral compound, waiting. At exactly 9 p.m., Pastor Kaunda's black Mercedes emerged from the gates. Kemi followed at a safe distance, her heart pounding with excitement and fear. She had done this twice before, but both times she had lost him in traffic or taken wrong turns. Tonight was different. She managed to stay behind him all the way to Ogbomoso without being detected. When Pastor Kaunda's car stopped at the cemetery gates, Kemi parked her car behind a cluster of trees about 50 meters away. Through her binoculars, she watched as an old man opened the gates and let the pastor inside. "What is a man of God doing in a cemetery at night?" she whispered to herself, taking photos with her long-lens camera. For the next hour, Kemi watched and photographed everything she could see from her hiding spot. She saw lights moving around inside the cemetery and heard strange chanting carried by the wind. When Pastor Kaunda finally emerged and drove away, she remained hidden until the old security guard locked the gates and returned to his small hut. Kemi knew she needed more evidence, but what she had witnessed already made her certain that something very unusual was happening in that cemetery every Thursday night. Over the next few weeks, Kemi researched everything she could about cemetery rituals and dark spiritual practices. She spoke with former practitioners of traditional African religions and consulted with university professors who studied occult practices. Dr. Emeka Okafor, a professor of African traditional religion at the University of Lagos, was particularly helpful. "What you're describing sounds like necromancy," he told her during their meeting at his office. "It's an ancient practice where someone attempts to gain power by interacting with the dead. In many West African cultures, there are beliefs about drawing spiritual energy from corpses, especially recently deceased ones." "But how would this relate to someone performing miracles in a Christian church?" Kemi asked. "Spiritual power is spiritual power," Dr. Okafor explained. "Someone practicing necromancy might be able to channel that dark energy to perform what appear to be miracles. But there would always be a price. The power wouldn't last forever, and it would require continuous renewal through more rituals." This explained Pastor Kaunda's weekly trips to the cemetery. But Kemi needed concrete proof before she could publish her story. She decided to try a different approach. Instead of following Pastor Kaunda, she would hide inside the cemetery before he arrived. The next Thursday evening, Kemi arrived at St. Mary's Cemetery just after sunset. She found a place where the old fence had partially collapsed and squeezed through. Her plan was to hide behind one of the larger monuments and photograph whatever Pastor Kaunda was doing. As she made her way through the cemetery, reading the names on old tombstones in the fading light, she felt a chill run down her spine. Some of the graves dated back over 100 years. She tried not to think about all the bodies buried beneath her feet. Kemi found a good hiding spot behind a large marble angel monument, about 30 meters from where she had seen the lights during her previous surveillance. She settled in to wait, checking her camera equipment and trying to calm her nerves. At exactly 9 p.m., she heard the cemetery gates creak open. Through her camera lens, she watched Pastor Kaunda and the old security guard walk toward a fresh grave. Her telephoto lens allowed her to see everything clearly. What she witnessed over the next hour was beyond anything she had imagined. She photographed Pastor Kaunda performing strange rituals over an open coffin, chanting in an unknown language and placing his hands on a casket. The images were disturbing, but provided exactly the evidence she needed. As she prepared to leave, Kemi accidentally knocked over a small decorative vase on the grave where she was hiding. The sound echoed through the quiet cemetery. "Who's there?" the security guard called out, shining his flashlight in her direction. Kemi's heart nearly stopped. She pressed herself flat against the marble monument, praying they wouldn't find her. After several minutes of searching, Pastor Kaunda and the guard gave up and continued with their ritual. But Kemi knew she had been too close to discovery. She needed to be more careful if she planned to continue her investigation. 3 weeks later, Kemi received an unexpected phone call from her contact at the city morgue, Dr. Sarah Oduya. "Kemi, you told me to call if anything unusual came up related to that cemetery you're investigating, Doctor," Oduya said. "We just received the body of an elderly woman who's going to be buried at St. Mary's tonight. But there's something special about this one." "What do you mean?" "Her name is Mama Grace Adebayo. She was 93 years old and spent her entire life as a devoted Christian. Her family says she prayed for 6 hours every day, never missed church, and spent all her time helping poor people in her community. When she died yesterday, she was holding her Bible and praying. Kemi felt a strange sense of anticipation. Why are you telling me this? Because people like her are rare. If your suspicions about that pastor are correct, and he's really doing what you think he's doing, what happens when he encounters someone who lived such a pure, holy life? That evening, Kemi positioned herself in the cemetery earlier than usual. She watched from her hiding spot as Mama Grace's simple funeral concluded just after sunset. The old woman's family couldn't afford an elaborate ceremony, but they sang beautiful hymns as they lowered her coffin into the ground. After the family left, Kemi waited in the darkness. She had a feeling that tonight would be different from all the others. At 9 p.m. sharp, Pastor Kaunda arrived as usual, but tonight something felt different to him as well. As he walked through the cemetery with Ibrahim, he felt an unusual heaviness in the air. "Pastor, the old woman was buried this afternoon," Ibrahim reported. "She lived to be 93. Her family said she was very religious." Pastor Kaunda nodded, but he felt strangely reluctant to proceed. In 20 years of performing these rituals, he had never hesitated before. Something about tonight felt ominous. They reached Mama Grace's grave, and Ibrahim began digging. As he worked, Pastor Kaunda prepared his ritual items, but his hands were shaking slightly. "Pastor, are you feeling all right?" Ibrahim asked, noticing his nervousness. "I'm fine, just dig faster." From her hiding spot, Kemi watched through her camera lens, taking photographs of everything. She could sense that something was different about tonight's ritual, though she couldn't pinpoint what it was. When Ibrahim finally reached the coffin, Pastor Kaunda climbed down into the grave, but as soon as his feet touched the bottom of the hole, he felt a powerful force pushing against him, as if the earth itself was rejecting his presence. "Open the coffin," he commanded, trying to ignore the strange sensation. Ibrahim pried open the simple wooden lid, revealing Mama Grace's peaceful face. She was dressed in a white gown, her hands folded over an old leather Bible. The moment Pastor Kaunda looked at the old woman's face, everything changed. As Pastor Kaunda stared down at Mama Grace's serene expression, her eyes suddenly opened. They weren't the cloudy eyes of death, but bright, clear eyes that seemed to look directly into his soul. "Matthew," a voice spoke, though Mama Grace's lips didn't move. It was a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "20 years you have defiled the dead. 20 years you have used my people for your selfish gain. 20 years you have built your kingdom on darkness while claiming to serve the light." Pastor Kaunda tried to step backward, but his feet seemed frozen to the ground. Above him, Ibrahim was backing away from the grave in terror. I was serving God," Pastor Kaunda stammered. "The miracles, the healings, the lives changed." "You were serving yourself," the voice continued. "You have stolen the rest of the dead and corrupted the faith of the living. Did you think I would not see? Did you think there would be no accounting?" The sky above the cemetery began to darken unnaturally. Clouds gathered from nowhere, and the wind began to howl through the trees. From her hiding spot, Kemi watched in amazement and terror. Her camera captured everything as supernatural forces seemed to be at work in the graveyard. "Please," Pastor Kaunda begged, falling to his knees in the grave. "I can change. I can stop. I can make amends." "The time for repentance has passed," the voice declared. "You have chosen your path, and now you will walk it to its end. But first, you will see the truth of what you have become." Suddenly, every grave in the cemetery began to glow with an eerie light. Pastor Kaunda could see the faces of every corpse he had violated over the past 20 years rising from their resting places. They surrounded the grave where he knelt, their expressions filled with sorrow and disappointment. "These are the souls you have disturbed," the voice explained. "These are the people whose eternal rest you have interrupted for your own gain. Look at them, remember them, and know that your power ends tonight." As the ghostly figures surrounded him, Pastor Kaunda finally understood the full weight of what he had done. Each face represented a person with a family, with dreams, with a life that had been cut short, and he had used their deaths to build his empire of false miracles. "I'm sorry," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I'm so sorry." But his apology came too late. Thunder began to rumble overhead, even though there had been no storm clouds moments before. The wind grew stronger, whipping through the cemetery and causing the trees to bend and creak. Mama Grace's spirit rose from her coffin, her form glowing with pure white light that was almost too bright to look at directly. "Your power was never your own," she said, her voice now clearly audible to everyone in the cemetery. "It was borrowed from the darkness, and now the darkness comes to collect its debt." From her hiding spot, Kemi watched in awe as supernatural forces played out before her eyes. Her camera continued clicking, documenting what might be the most incredible story ever recorded. Ibrahim, the old security guard, was trying to run away, but he seemed to be moving in slow motion, as if the very air had become thick as water. "You too have played your part," Mama Grace's spirit said to Ibrahim. 20 years you have enabled this abomination. 20 years you have been silent, while evil masqueraded as good." Pastor Kaunda looked up at the sky as lightning began to flash overhead. He knew his time had come. The power he had wielded for 20 years was about to be taken from him, and he would face the consequences of his choices. "What will happen to my church?" he asked desperately. "What about all the people who believed in me?" "They will learn the truth," Mama Grace replied, "and some will despair, but others will find the real God they were always seeking. Your deception ends tonight." The thunder grew louder, shaking the ground beneath the cemetery. Pastor Kaunda could feel his borrowed power draining away, like water through a broken dam. The supernatural abilities that had made him famous were disappearing, leaving him feeling hollow and empty. "Please," he begged one final time, "give me another chance." "You have had 20 years of chances," the spirit replied firmly. "Every Thursday night was an opportunity to stop, to repent, to choose a different path. Instead, you chose to go deeper into darkness." The ghostly figures of all the violated dead began to fade away, their purpose fulfilled. They had been witnesses to Pastor Kaunda's judgment, and now they could return to their eternal rest. Mama Grace's spirit looked down at the trembling pastor with a mixture of sadness and divine justice. "Your sight allowed you to see the miracles you performed with stolen power," she said. "Now you will walk in darkness, as your soul has walked in darkness for 20 years. At that moment, a massive bolt of lightning split the sky and struck the cemetery with tremendous force. The light was so bright that it turned night into day for several seconds. When it hit, Pastor Kaunda screamed as searing pain shot through his eyes. From her hiding spot, Kemi was temporarily blinded by the flash. When her vision returned, she saw Pastor Kaunda kneeling close to the grave, his hands pressed against his eyes, blood seeping between his fingers. "I can't see," he screamed. "I can't see anything." Ibrahim rushed to help him, both men stumbling through the cemetery toward the exit. Pastor Kaunda's eyes had been burned by the divine lightning, leaving him completely blind. As they reached the cemetery gates, Pastor Kaunda collapsed to his knees again. "My power," he whispered. "It's gone. All of it. I can't feel anything." For the first time in 20 years, Pastor Matthew Kaunda was just an ordinary man. The supernatural abilities that had made him famous throughout Africa had vanished with the lightning strike. He was blind, powerless, and broken. Kemi emerged from her hiding spot after Pastor Kaunda and Ibrahim had left the cemetery. Her hands were shaking as she reviewed the photographs and video footage she had captured. The evidence was overwhelming, but she knew that some of what she had witnessed would be difficult for people to believe. She decided to focus on what could be proven. The photographs of Pastor Kaunda performing rituals with corpses, the testimony she could gather from people who knew about his Thursday night activities, and the dramatic change that was about to occur in his ministry. The next morning, news spread quickly through Lagos that Pastor Matthew Kaunda had been found wandering the streets near his village, completely blind and apparently having suffered some kind of mental breakdown. He was taken to a private hospital where doctors could find no medical explanation for his sudden blindness. More importantly for Kemi's investigation, people began to notice that something had changed about the pastor's ministry. The miracles that had made him famous stopped happening entirely. During his next scheduled television broadcast, Pastor Kaunda sat silently on stage, unable to perform any of the supernatural feats that his audience expected. Within a week, attendance at New Life Cathedral dropped by half. Within a month, several of his international branches closed. The government ministers and politicians who had sought his blessing suddenly stopped taking his calls. Kemi spent the next month carefully preparing her exposé. She interviewed former employees of Pastor Kaunda's ministry, researched the timing of his rise to fame, and consulted with experts on religious fraud and occult practices. She also managed to track down Ibrahim, the cemetery security guard. At first, he refused to speak with her, but after Pastor Kaunda's dramatic fall from grace, he became more willing to tell the truth. "I knew it was wrong," Ibrahim admitted during their recorded interview, "but the money was too good, and I told myself that maybe God would forgive us because the pastor was helping so many people. I see now that I was just making excuses." Ibrahim provided details about the 20-year arrangement, the specific rituals that Pastor Kaunda performed, and the frequency of their meetings. His testimony corroborated everything that Kemi had witnessed and photographed. When Kemi's story was finally published in the Lagos Tribune, it sent shockwaves throughout Africa and beyond. The article, titled "The Dark Secret of Pastor Matthew Kaunda: How Africa's Most Famous Miracle Worker Built His Empire on Death," became the most read news story in West African history. The article included photographs of Pastor Kaunda in the cemetery, testimony from Ibrahim, expert analysis of necromantic practices, and a detailed timeline showing how his sudden rise to fame coincided with the beginning of his Thursday night rituals. The response to Kemi's exposé was immediate and dramatic. Governments in several countries launched investigations into Pastor Kaunda's financial dealings. His television program was cancelled. His books were pulled from stores. Several of his former followers filed lawsuits, claiming they had been defrauded. But perhaps most significantly, many genuine Christians who had been genuinely helped by attending his services began to question what had really happened to them. Some of his members concluded that their healing or blessing had been the result of their own faith in God, not the pastor's power. Others fell into despair, wondering if their spiritual experiences had been real at all. Pastor Kaunda himself remained in seclusion, still blind and now completely abandoned by the empire he had built. The few loyal followers who remained with him tried to claim that his blindness was a test from God, like Job in the Bible, but most people saw it as divine justice for his deception. In a strange twist, some of the most dramatic transformations occurred among people who had been on the periphery of Pastor Kaunda's ministry. Samuel, his former assistant, began his own small church focused on simple, authentic Christian teaching. Several former employees became missionaries, dedicating their lives to serving God without seeking fame or fortune. 3 months after the exposé was published, Kemi received an unexpected phone call. Pastor Matthew Kaunda wanted to give her an exclusive interview. They met at a small guest house outside Lagos, where the former miracle worker was staying with one of his few remaining supporters. Pastor Kaunda looked dramatically different from the confident, powerful figure who had once commanded stadiums full of followers. He was thin, his hair had turned completely grey, and his eyes were covered by dark sunglasses. "Why did you want to speak with me?" Kemi asked, setting up her recording equipment. Pastor Kaunda was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft and broken. "I want people to know the truth," he said. "All of it. Not just what you discovered, but what really happened that night in the cemetery." For the next 2 hours, Pastor Kaunda told Kemi everything. He described his first meeting with Dr. Kwame Asante, the old man who had taught him the necromantic rituals. He explained how the power had been intoxicating at first, but had gradually corrupted everything good in his life. He talked about the night when Mama Grace's spirit had confronted him with the truth of his actions. "I saw them all," he said, tears streaming down his cheeks behind the sunglasses. "Every person whose rest I had disturbed. Every family who had buried a loved one, only to have me violate their memory for my own gain. I finally understood what I had become." "Do you believe blindness was divine punishment?" Kemi asked. Pastor Kaunda nodded slowly. "I know it was. But it's also mercy." "How is blindness mercy?" "Because now I can't see the wealth I accumulated through deception. I can't see the crowds that used to worship me. I can't see the material things that I thought made me important. For the first time in 20 years, I have to rely entirely on God's grace, not on stolen power. As their interview was concluding, Pastor Kaunda made a request that surprised Kemi. I want to go back to the cemetery, he said. I want to visit Mama Grace's grave and ask for her forgiveness. Kemi was reluctant to return to the place where she had witnessed such supernatural events, but she was also curious to see what would happen. She agreed to drive him there. When they arrived at St. Mary's Cemetery, they found Ibrahim sitting on a bench near the entrance. The old security guard looked up as they approached, his face filled with shame and regret. Pastor Ibrahim said quietly, "I've been coming here every day since that night, asking God to forgive me." "We were both guilty," Pastor Kaunda replied, "but maybe it's not too late for us to make things right." The three of them walked together through the cemetery to Mama Grace's grave. Fresh flowers had been placed there by family members, and someone had installed a proper headstone with her name and dates. Pastor Kaunda knelt beside the grave and began to pray aloud. "Mama Grace, I know you can't hear me now, but I need to say this anyway. I'm sorry for what I did to you and to all the others. I'm sorry for using your memory for evil purposes. I'm sorry for deceiving people who were looking for God. I can't undo the past 20 years, but I want to spend whatever time I have left trying to make amends." As he prayed, something unexpected happened. Kemi, who was taking notes, noticed that Pastor Kaunda's voice was getting stronger and more confident. When he finished praying and stood up, he seemed different somehow. "I can see light," he whispered, pulling off his sunglasses. "Just a little bit, but I can see light." Over the following weeks, Pastor Kaunda's eyesight gradually returned. It wasn't the instant dramatic miracle that people expected from his old ministry, but a slow, natural healing that doctors couldn't fully explain. More importantly, he began to experience something he hadn't felt in 20 years: genuine peace. Pastor Kaunda used his restored vision to read the Bible extensively, often spending entire days studying passages about forgiveness, redemption, and authentic faith. He also began visiting the families of people whose graves he had violated, asking for their forgiveness and offering to make financial restitution from what remained of his wealth. Many families were initially angry and refused to see him, but others, particularly those who were struggling financially, accepted his help and were moved by his obvious remorse. Ibrahim, the former cemetery guard, became Pastor Kaunda's closest companion in his efforts to make amends. Together, they established a small organization dedicated to helping poor families pay for proper burials for their loved ones, ensuring that everyone could be laid to rest with dignity. Kemi continued to follow the story, publishing several follow-up articles about Pastor Kaunda's attempts at redemption. Her original exposé had won several journalism awards and launched her career as an investigative reporter, but she found the story of his transformation equally compelling. 1 year after the events at Mama Grace's grave, Pastor Kaunda faced his greatest test yet. A delegation of his former followers, led by some of the wealthy businessmen and politicians who had supported his ministry, came to visit him. "Pastor," said Chief Adebola, a wealthy oil executive, "we've been watching your transformation over the past year. We want to make you an offer." Pastor Kaunda, who now lived in a simple apartment and wore plain clothes, listened carefully. "We're willing to restore your ministry," Chief Adebola continued. "New buildings, television programs, international conferences. All you have to do is return to the old ways. People need miracles, Pastor. They need hope. What does it matter where the power comes from if it helps people?" For a moment, Pastor Kaunda was silent. The offer was tempting. He could have his old life back, his influence, his wealth, his fame. All he had to do was return to the cemetery on Thursday nights. "I understand the appeal," Pastor Kaunda finally said. "I spent 20 years believing that the end justifies the means. But I learned something important. When you build your foundation on lies, everything you construct will eventually collapse." "But think of all the good you could do," Chief Adebola pressed. "The hospitals you could build, the schools, the charitable works." "I can do those things without stealing power from the dead," Pastor Kaunda replied firmly. "True service to God doesn't require supernatural abilities. It requires love, compassion, and integrity. I may never perform another miracle, but at least I can sleep peacefully, knowing that my hands are clean. The delegation left disappointed, but Pastor Kaunda felt stronger than he had in years. He had been offered everything he had once valued most, and he had chosen to remain on the difficult path of authentic redemption. 2 years after Kemi's original exposé, she received another unexpected phone call. This time it was from Dr. Sarah Oduya at the city morgue. "Kemi, you remember that cemetery case you investigated? Well, something interesting has happened." "What do you mean?" asked Kemi. "We just processed the death certificate for Dr. Kwame Asante. He was the old man who originally taught Pastor Kaunda those necromantic rituals. He died alone in a shack outside the city, apparently from natural causes." Kemi was intrigued. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because when we cleaned out his belongings, we found something you should see." The next day, Kemi met Dr. Oduya at the morgue. Among Dr. Asante's possessions was an old journal filled with detailed records of everyone he had taught his dark rituals over the past 50 years. "Look at this, Doctor," Oduya said, pointing to specific entries. "Pastor Kaunda wasn't his only student. There are names here of religious leaders, politicians, and businessmen from all over West Africa. Some of them are still practicing these rituals." The journal contained detailed descriptions of necromantic practices, lists of cemeteries where the rituals were performed, and records of payments made to various accomplices. It was a roadmap to a network of corruption that extended far. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to this channel for the final part of this story, and please make sure you drop your comment and share your thoughts with us.